there was a man running as fast as he could toward the meeting house, and he at once asked the Quakers for help. He said he was being pursued. Not far behind were men on horseback looking for him, to capture him, to take him back into slavery. And just as they had feared, up the road came men on horseback.
The Quaker
Podcast.
Story, spirit, sound.
I'm Georgia Sparling.
And I'm Jon Watts.
And it is hot in the Northern Hemisphere.
Oh, man. Yeah, we have been sweating here.
But that does mean it's summer. And there's one thing I love to do during the summer, and that's a road trip.
Oh, nice. Yeah, I mean, I'm more of a bicycle guy myself, but I can get into it. What do you love about road trips?
Well, I love the freedom of being able to stop whenever I want and to explore things that I might see just on the side of the road. And, that's what we're going to be doing today. So a month or so ago, while I was in Ohio, I got to spend some time along the Quaker Scenic Byway, which was a real education for me. A year ago, I certainly could not have told you that there was a strong Quaker presence in Ohio, but now I know that in the 1800s, thousands of Friends left the South where it was becoming increasingly dangerous for them because of their anti-slavery stance.
Right. Yeah, you can, interesting tidbit. You can basically map the movement of 18th and 19th century Quakers by following the Wilmingtons. So many Quakers moved from southeastern Pennsylvania to North Carolina, so Wilmington, Delaware, and Wilmington, North Carolina, and ended up in Wilmington, Ohio, which is the home of the Scenic Byway. So anyway, tell us about it. What is the Scenic Byway?
Well, it's a drivable tour of Quaker sites, most of them historical, that often shows the hidden side of Quakers in this area. And it tells the story of these people who did some really remarkable things, some on small scale, some on a large scale, from rescuing enslaved people to making a name for themselves on an international scale. And it's very official. It's been designated by the Ohio Department of Transportation, and there's an interactive map online. So it's this really well thought out and well-designed Quaker experience.
Wow, yeah, that is official. I see a historic plaque every so often in Philly, but as far as I know, we don't have a Scenic Byway. Quakerism is so much more than just its history. But as someone who loves stories and feeling connected to spiritual ancestors and shared history, I appreciate the opportunity to hear about faithful friends of the past.
Yeah, certainly.
So, ready for a road trip?
Let's go. All right, our first stop. So tell me a little bit, where are we right now?
Well, right now we're standing in the burial ground or the cemetery of the Springfield Friends meeting at 121 Todd's Fork Road, Clinton County, Ohio. And this is one of the major stops of the Quaker Scenic Byway tour. This is a particularly interesting spot in that some of the earliest Quaker settlers in Clinton County arrived here in 1806 and the next decade or so, mostly from North Carolina.
It's a hot June day, and I'm standing in a cemetery in southwestern Ohio with Christine Snyder, who has been my host during my stay in Ohio. We're deep into Quaker country, and today we're sampling stops along the Quaker Scenic Byway.
It is 54 miles total in a loop, and there are 55 sites. It's not stops, but sites. So when we put together the route, we classified the sites as places that you are going to drive by and take a look. And then other places where you can stop and get out of your car and look around and take a photo. And then there are other sites where you can go in. So there as a variety of experiences.
Christine, along with the former and the current directors of the Quaker Heritage Center at Wilmington College, took on much of the development of the Quaker Scenic Byway. They mapped out the sites, tested each location, and wrote the descriptions on the interactive map. Of course, town boards, community associations, visitors bureaus, and planning commissions, among others, also contributed to the project. But the idea came from an anonymous donor who gave the Quaker Heritage Center a $10,000 grant to get the project underway. It now joins 27 other byways under the auspices of the Ohio Department of Transportation. But if you have a question about the byway, you ask Christine.
I've been a Quaker all my life and grew up here, so I knew a bit of background about the history, and I was familiar with the location of the meetings. And so we started with that. And then what happened, of course, each time that we would visit a site and talk about it and say, is this the right site? Someone would say, but have you thought about this one? Or, Christine, have you ever seen this house? So our knowledge base just spread because people would give us suggestions, and we would just learn and learn and learn and learn. So we had to put together a route that was limited to what a traveler could cover in one day and not drive too many miles. Then we had to think of stops and facilities and restrooms and places to have lunch and opening hours with lots of details. So we did the best we could to put together a route that would be a fun day trip for a family or individuals, and that they could enjoy the amenities of both Wilmington, Ohio and Waynesville, Ohio.
Today, as I said, we're starting at a cemetery, which in many ways tells the story of the arrival of Quakers to this area. It's off a country road, as are most of the sites on the byway, and it's a big, expansive space with tall, leafy trees. According to Christine, this one was designed by the former gardener of a Russian Tsar who had settled in the area. Overlooking this space is the Springfield Friends meeting, where Christine is a member and where generations of her family have worshipped.
The extended Harvey, Hale, and Hadley family, 5 brothers, 2 sisters, and the widowed grandmothers, settled on this survey. They divided up the land and sold land to other Quakers families as well. One of the first things they did was set up their Quaker meeting.
The meeting was established in 1809 and has gone through a few different buildings. But today, I want to learn about the virtual who's who of Quaker worshipers who are represented in this cemetery. One is Eli Harvey, who was born in 1868 and buried here in 1957. Eli was an internationally recognized painter and sculptor whose work is still featured in the Smithsonian Museum of Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and many other places. Eli got his start right here, meeting for worship at Springfield Friends Meeting and attending school in the one-room Quaker schoolhouse.
His most famous work is animals. While he was studying in Paris, he discovered that he was particularly interested in animals, and particularly felines. But one of his really famous sculptures is the brown bear, the mascot of Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island, a life-size grizzly bear.
Yeah, I know it well. I actually graduated from Brown, and I never knew who made the giant bear sculpture that's so iconic to our campus. But Eli Harvey is not the only notable Quaker buried here. There's also Martha Hadley, one of several ancestors of Christine's who are buried here. Martha was a single woman when she traveled to a remote corner of Alaska in the 1890s. She was a missionary and a teacher who was not only embraced by the Inupiat village where she lived, but who helped to establish a Quaker meeting there that has survived for more than 100 years. She's really fascinating, so we're going to do a whole story on her one day. As we're going along, Christine has stories about most of the people buried in these historic graves, including one about a Quaker prophet whose widow is interred in the cemetery and who is the reason that many Quakers came to Ohio. Wait, prophet?
Yes, prophet. Ruthite Dix was the widow of Zachariah Dix. Zachariah intended to come here, but he did not live long enough. Zachariah Dix is the Quaker prophet, in that there's a small book called The Bush River Prophecy, Bush River, South Carolina. In the late 1700s, early 1800s, Zachariah Dix was a traveling minister and traveled throughout the areas where Quakers were and into North Carolina, where Quakers had settled in the 1700s. He prophesied a bloody internecine war whose cause would be slavery. And he told the Quakers that they should leave the South and should come to the North, into the Northwest Territory, where by the ordinance slavery was forbidden forever. And Quakers heard the prophecy, and they listened, and they left the South by the thousands and came to the Northwest Territory, settling mostly in Southwest Ohio and Indiana. He was the impetus for the great migration of Quakers coming to the free territory, the frontier, the wilderness of Ohio. Yes, the Bush River Prophecy.
Although Zachariah Dix did not live to see the end of slavery, many of the Quakers who heeded his warning found safety in Ohio and were able to continue the work of abolition and racial equality. And we'll hear more about that on our next stop. Stop number 2.
Well, this is one of the most popular stops on the Quaker Scenic Byway, the Harveysburg Free Black School, built in 1831, founded by Elizabeth Burgess Harvey, who was the wife of Dr. Jesse Harvey.
We're standing in front of a small, white, rectangular building with a few houses nearby and a big ginkgo tree overhead.
It has an interesting architecture, as you might look at it and say, well, that looks like a Quaker meeting house. And it certainly does. It's the classic rectangle, twice as wide as it is deep, the 2 doors and the tall windows. So it became a private home after the school closed. But then the folks here in Harveysburg saw the need to preserve it and purchased it and restored it into what may look a lot like it did at that time. In the early days, there were several black families in this region, families that had been helped to freedom into the north, free families that were living, and Elizabeth saw that they needed an opportunity for education. And so she founded a school particularly for free black children. So the people who attended this school were people from the neighborhood, plus the word got out, and plantation owners in the South would send their half-black children north to the care of the Harveys to be educated at the Harveysburg School. The school was founded in 1831, and it lasted until 1909. So
That's a long time.
It's a long time, and so it served a good purpose. And they have a festival here. It now belongs to the Harveysburg Historical Society. And at the last fall festival, there was a woman who attended whose grandmother had studied at this school. So the history is not that old.
I think it's really cool that this history has been so well preserved and cared for. It's such a beautiful legacy of the Quaker pursuit of equality that has manifested itself in such a tangible way. All right, should we go to our next stop? After the break, we're going to hear how some clever Quaker women hid a man on the run, and we'll see the lasting impacts of a famous Quaker schism.
You can cut this.
That's Liz Engie, and in that little clip there, her husband and I were trying to convince her to go on the record and share her thoughts about the podcast. Liz was not at all convinced that she had anything worthwhile to say, and for the record, you're about to find out that she was wrong. So I met Liz during my recent travels to the Midwest. She's a longtime member of Wilmington Friends Meeting in Wilmington, Ohio, and she's also on their Sunshine Committee, which, as I understand it, is their welcoming committee. And I can attest to you that she is very good at that role. But let Liz speak.
I was raised Catholic. That ended up not being a good fit for me. And I was looking for something different, but really didn't know if it was out there. And I ended up attending a Quaker funeral for a work colleague. And it was just so lovely and so different. It really spoke to me.
Over the course of a few years, Liz kept being reminded of Quakers. She picked up a novel and it had a Quaker character in it. Then one day she got lost and found herself standing in front of a Quaker museum.
So I thought, okay, I'm going to look into this. So I decided we would go to a number of different meetings in the area and see if any of them were a good fit, because I understood that they can vary to some degree. So we ended up coming to Wilmington Friends, and it just felt like home. It's a welcoming community, and that's just really important to me, that everyone is welcome. It meets my needs, and I like that it meets other people's needs.
So switching gears a little bit, so you said you listened to the podcast. So how did you find out about Thee Quaker?
Actually, I'm a big fan of the podcast, and I'm your groupie. So Jon had come to our meeting. I became aware of it then, and I love it. And what I really love about it is that it shows people that regardless of where you're at or what you're believing, there's probably a place for you in the Quaker community, or even if you don't want to be part of the Quaker community in a more formal way, that the testimonies of Quakerism, I just really think that's what the world needs right now. You know, simplicity and integrity and peace and equality and community. What's not to love about that, right? And if that's all of our foundation, then think of all the beautiful things that we can do together.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Do you have an episode that sticks out in your mind as something that's resonated with you?
I love how varied they are. I love it that you've talked to a Quaker farmer. I love it that you've highlighted meetings in Africa. I love that you talked about the history of pamphlets. You know, I just love that you cover it all. I never know what you're going to talk about. I try not to peek ahead of time. And I've learned a lot about being Quaker and Quaker beliefs. And even though, you know, this is a great community for me, I like knowing what other communities are doing, you know, people's experiences and what they bring. It just makes it all so much richer. And the Quaker Podcast does an excellent job of highlighting all of that and just, you know, bringing more sunshine to the world.
Awesome. Thank you.
You're welcome.
It's so wonderful to hear how Liz and other listeners have been impacted by this show. It's a place of learning and connection for so many people, and it has the potential to reach so many more. That's why we do these segments, and we ask you, our listeners, to become podcast supporters. We want to keep the show going and growing and reaching more people who don't know that we're out there yet. And that's why we ask if you would consider being part of this project and giving $5, $10, $15, $20 a month, whatever is in your budget. You can go to QuakerPodcast.com, click on support at the top of the page to learn more. Thank you so much. Now back to the show. There are a few towns along the byway, but it's mostly rural. Many of the sites are along 2-lane roads that are thick with cornfields and dotted with farmhouses.
Our community is a rural community, and both Waynesville and Wilmington are small towns. They are both historic towns, and there's lots of farmland in between. Now, of course, our community is crossed by a huge freeway, I-71, and some major highways, but much of the byway is on small country roads driving through farmlands. That's part of the objective, is to get people out of town and out in the countryside to enjoy the beauty of the Ohio landscape, and to visit places that are a bit remote, perhaps, places that they have never seen before.
All right, stop number 3.
So here we are in the Quaker historic area of Waynesville, Ohio. This is Warren County. And sitting here looking at the white brick meeting house, and we can see the red brick meeting house on the other side.
The first meeting house is the Miami Meeting, built in 1811. Thousands of Quakers who had migrated from the South transferred their meeting membership here between 1799 and around the 1840s, as their anti-slavery stance became a source of hostility among their slave-owning neighbors. But the impending Civil War wasn't the only schism on the minds of these Quakers.
In the late 1820s, there was a deep division in the Society of Friends in America. And it affected this meeting, this very large meeting, and the meeting split in two. And so the group that was later called Orthodox went back across the street, back to where the original log cabin had been, where they had first met, next to the burial ground, and built a second meeting house. So here in Waynesville, we have 2 meeting houses side by side with just the street coming between them. And the cemetery was divided in 2 parts. So there was the Hicksite part and the Orthodox part. It's hard to, from this distance, understand that split. But basically what happened is the group that became to be called Orthodox, which then became part of FUM, the Friends United Meeting, they did things like sing hymns and accept a pastor and a paid pastor, and then moved into programmed worship, very similar to the Methodists, very much influenced by the Methodists. While the Hicksites, so named because of the preaching of Elias Hicks, who actually visited this meeting house during that time, the 1827-28, the Hicksites believed that they should retain more of the practices and philosophies of the early Quakers in England, the teachings of George Fox, and then the preaching of Elias Hicks, with an emphasis on simplicity and the leading of the Spirit individually, and the lack of paid ministry. So a Miami Meeting here has existed for a couple hundred years, and they've never had a pastor.
I can't imagine going to meeting every week, kind of seeing the other half on the other side of the road, and like how that, I mean, just the constant reminder of the conflict.
Well, there were some families where they would all ride to a meeting in their carriage, and then some of the family members would go into the red brick, and some of the family members would go into the white brick.
Yeah. Even though it was, I mean, obviously contentious enough that they split in 2, did they still get along okay?
Yes. Mm-hmm. They lived in the same town and they were part of the same community.
Mm-hmm. That may be something unique to Quakers, to be able to still get along really well after kind of a pretty big theological split. Many years ago, I was at a women's retreat, and the speaker said something to us that I haven't forgotten. She said people in the Bible were constantly in transition, and so we should expect that we will always be in some form of transition as well. And I can certainly see that in the lives of the Quakers who settled here in Ohio. They had this transition from the South to the Midwest, from a theologically united meeting to a major schism. And our next stop represents a geographical change. Back in the 1970s, Cedar Creek Lake was dammed, flooding thousands of acres of land and displacing some 300 people. And that included a Quaker meeting. Okay. Stop 4.
So we've arrived at the Cedars Creek Pioneer Village. It's a collection of old houses and buildings made of logs. When the lake was being constructed, some old structures were discovered, and a group formed to salvage and improve these structures and move other structures that were found in the community to one place.
The Pioneer Village Park is uninhabited except for festivals, but it's open to walk through any time and lies along a local trail. There are at least a dozen historic buildings situated in a circle around a green, and it's not hard to imagine this as a real village. I could almost see women in their bonnets and long skirts coming out of their homes, or cows grazing in the paddock out front.
So many of the preserved or relocated log buildings were built by early Quaker settlers in the Waynesville area. One of the buildings that was brought here is Caesars Creek Friends Meeting House. Caesars Creek Friends Meeting House was established in 1805, and the meeting house was built, this one was built in 1849, on a bluff above the west bank of the Caesars Creek Gorge. And then, due to the building of the lake, the meeting closed in 1967. In 1975, the meeting house was moved over 15 miles of road to the Pioneer Village Park, and it was put on a new foundation, and it serves as part of the outdoor museum.
With the removal of the meeting and the flooding of the land, the Caesars Creek Friends mostly moved elsewhere, says Christine. But with the preservation of the meeting house, their history lives on.
There's a story that goes with the Caesars Creek Meeting House that is an interesting one to think about.
One Sunday in the 1850s, as the Friends gathered for worship, someone saw a black man running for his life towards their meeting house. Although slavery was illegal in Ohio, it was legal for slave owners to pursue runaways, and this man had obviously done just that.
And he at once asked the Quakers for help. He said he was being pursued. Not far behind were men on horseback looking for him, to capture him, to take him back into slavery. And he asked for help. Well, the Quakers at that moment were gathering, seating themselves on the benches, the facing benches on one side, and seated on the facing benches were the elders who were women, who at that time were wearing dresses with very full, long skirts. So the fugitive was invited into the meeting house. The women indicated to the fugitive to crawl under the bench, and they all sat close together and spread their full skirts out. A few of the men chose to stay outside at the doorway. And just as they had feared, up the road came men on horseback. They rode up to the meeting house, jumped off, went up to the Friends who were standing there and said, "Has any slave passed by here this morning?" And the Friends answered, "No slave has passed by our door today." So, you were thinking, were they telling the truth? Because Friends were very careful about speaking the truth. And the truth was that no slave had passed by their door that day, because he was still in the meeting house. And they kept him there until they felt they could take him to a place of safety and then move him on the Underground Railroad northward to freedom.
This is just a great story of how these Quakers put their faith into action with some quick thinking and creativity. I mean, I would love to know the thoughts of these women as they're sheltering this man under their dresses during what was supposed to be just a regular Sunday meeting for worship. Okay, but it was hot out there, so it was time for us to get back in the car and head to our final stop, and it's one that has special significance for Christine. All right, last stop. Is this your room?
It was when we were little girls. There were 4 little girls in the family. There were 2 double beds. And my oldest sister and youngest sister slept in this bed. And my next sister and myself slept in this bed. And we had 1 small closet.
For our last stop, we're at Christine's childhood home, which is still in the family. It's one of the places on the byway that is not generally open to the public, though it is available as an Airbnb.
My father bought the house in 1935 when he was a young farmer, hoping to start his own farm and find a wife. So my parents were married in 1937 and began their life here on their wedding day, on their wedding night, and lived here for 53 years and raised a family of 5 children, 4 daughters and 1 son.
The house has been Quaker since the first cornerstone was laid.
This Eli Harvey,
Not the artist.
who built this house, was 3 years old when he came in a covered wagon across the mountains through the Cumberland Gap, traveling with a large group of Quaker families and neighbors from North Carolina to settle in what's now Clinton County, Ohio. Eli grew up, married, and bought land from his father for this farm and built the house. The house is dated at 1830 or 1832.
The house is on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's full of details that give a clue as to the simplicity of Quaker living. The rooms are modest and practical, adorned with handmade details. There are quilts on display, as well as dresses that belong to Christine's forebears, and there's even ledgers written in meticulous script that give a clue as to the day-to-day transactions of a farming family. The house itself is surrounded by cornfields with a barn out back and a front porch that is perfect for watching the sunset. Why should people stop at this house along the byway?
So it has a charm to it that is lovely. People like to just come and be here. There are so few of the original houses and barns left that we've taken upon ourselves, my husband and I, as a project to maintain this place as well as we can while we're still here.
There is an astounding abundance of Quaker history in this corner of the country, and the Quaker Scenic Byway is helping to preserve it for future generations. Keeping that history alive is something about which Christine is intensely passionate. Why is the Scenic Byway so important?
Well, we are not a very visible presence anymore in the places where Quakers settled in large numbers in the early 1800s. So this gave us an opportunity to bring attention to some historic sites that are in danger of being forgotten about or being abandoned, and to also remind the community of its own history, and then to invite tourists from outside to learn a little bit more about the Quaker influence in Southwest Ohio.
The project started with an anonymous grant in 2010 and took almost 12 years to complete, but
it's finished, it's ready to follow, and it's beautiful.
Thank you for listening, and thank you to Christine Snyder for taking us on this tour. If you're interested in learning more about the Scenic Byway, I do encourage you to go for a visit. There are lots of Quaker meetings to check out in that area, including one that will feature in next week's episode. And the area is a reasonably short drive from several Ohio cities. I provided a link to the Quaker Scenic Byway on our episode page at QuakerPodcast.com. This episode was reported, written, and edited by me, Georgia Sparling. Jon Watts co-hosted and wrote and performed the music. Studio D mixed the episode, and your moment of Quaker Zen will be read by Grace Gonklevsky. If you like what you hear, please consider becoming a podcast supporter. You can do that on a monthly and now on a yearly basis. Head to QuakerPodcast.com and click on support to learn more. And now for your moment of Quaker Zen.
Elizabeth Gray Vining, 1970. Minor ecstasies are bits of stardust, which are for all of us, however limited our opportunities. Something seen, something heard, something felt flashes upon one with a bright freshness, and the heart, tired and sick, or sad, or merely indifferent, stirs and lifts in answer. Exercising our faculty for minor ecstasies may actually increase the number of them we feel.
Sign up for daily or weekly Quaker wisdom to accompany you on your spiritual path. Just go to dailyquaker.com. That's dailyquaker.com.